The courtroom was silent until a cop slapped a teenage black girl in full view of the judge. She didn't cry. She didn't scream. She looked him dead in the eyes and whispered, "You just turned this into a federal case." What happened next didn't just shake the room, it shook the system. And when the man who walked through those courtroom doors said, "I'm here for my daughter," the silence became unstoppable. Subscribe to RonStories if you believe that quiet justice is sometimes the loudest form of power, because some stories don't scream, they echo. The room was silent long before she entered, the kind of silence that didn't wait for a gavel to fall. It was the kind that settled into the walls, the people, the eyes that had already decided she was guilty. The double doors creaked open. A girl, no older than 15, walked in alone. Her lip was split. Blood dried at the corner of her mouth, wrists cuffed in front. No family beside her. No lawyer holding her hand. Just the heavy shuffle of her sneakers against the tiled floor of courtroom 2B, the smallest courtroom in the building. The one with the flickering light and the broken vent that hummed like a broken promise. No one looked surprised, not the bailiff who barely glanced at her, not the clerk who kept typing like she hadn't noticed the blood, not the prosecutor who smirked like this was routine. They said her name was Zaria Lane. They said she assaulted an officer. They said she resisted arrest. They didn't say anything about the video she filmed. They didn't mention what Officer Matthew Brener did to the man on the sidewalk, an elderly black man who had asked a question too loudly and was met with a baton to the ribs. They didn't mention how Zaria had pulled out her phone, hadn't screamed, hadn't interfered, just filmed. And that was the problem. The video had gone viral for a day before it disappeared. Flagged, removed, re-uploaded, flagged again. And when she got home that night, 2 officers were waiting at her door. Her mom never came back from the store that afternoon. The neighbor said she'd been taken to answer some questions. Zaria hadn't seen her since. So now, Zaria sat at the defense table in a courtroom where the clock above the judge hadn't worked in years. She said nothing. Her lawyer, a man who looked like he hadn't slept in weeks, whispered things to her that didn't seem to matter. She didn't respond. Then Officer Brener walked in. He didn't wear his usual smug expression. Today, he looked eager. He made sure everyone saw him, his uniform pressed, his nameplate glinting. He stepped past the gallery, past the defendant's table, then stopped, right in front of Zaria. No one said a word. The judge hadn't entered yet. Brener leaned in close. His breath smelled like mint gum and something sour underneath. He whispered, "You should have kept your mouth shut." Then crack. His hand moved faster than anyone expected. A full slap, open palm, across the side of her face. It echoed in the room like a gunshot. Chairs creaked. A woman in the back gasped. But no one stood. No one yelled. The bailiff didn't move. The clerk kept typing. Zaria didn't cry. She didn't scream. She turned her head slowly back to face him. Blood now trickling down her chin. Her eyes weren't wild or broken. They were still. Focus. She raised her cuffed hands and wiped the blood away. "You just turned this into a federal case," she said. And suddenly, everything stopped. Officer Brener stepped back, smirking like he'd just proven a point not just to Zaria, but to everyone watching. The judge hadn't entered yet, and maybe that was the point. No cameras, no accountability. The prosecutor, Heather Drennan, adjusted her necklace and flipped a page on her legal pad. Expression unchanged. She didn't glance at the girl bleeding in front of her. She didn't need to. The silence said enough. The court door finally opened again. Judge Martin Collier shuffled in, robes wrinkled, eyes tired like he'd already made up his mind days ago. He didn't look at Zaria, didn't ask about the blood, just settled into his seat and tapped the gavel once, as if the last 10 minutes hadn't happened. "Let's proceed," he muttered. Brener returned to the witness stand. He moved slowly, deliberately, like a man who knew the system would protect him no matter what he did. And when he began to speak, his voice was steady. Control. He told the court that Zaria had interfered with police operations, that she was hostile, combative, and uncooperative. His words were smooth, practiced, like he'd rehearsed them in front of a mirror. Zaria didn't interrupt. She didn't react at all. She sat beside her lawyer, hands cuffed in front of her, blood still wet on her lip. She wasn't slouched or broken, just still, the kind of still that didn't scream defeated, but warned of something waiting. Her lawyer, Eli Randall, finally spoke, quiet, hesitant. "Your Honor, we'd like to submit video evidence, civilian-captured footage, from a nearby electronics store. Timestamp, unaltered." The judge didn't look up. Admissibility. Heather Drennan didn't even wait. Unverified. Chain of custody is unclear. "We object." Judge Collier nodded, still not looking at Zariah. Objection sustained. Eli opened his mouth again, more urgently this time. "But Your Honor, the video shows. The court has ruled." Collier snapped. A pause. Eli sat back. Zariah blinked once. Across the room, someone in the gallery finally moved. A man. Tall. Dark suit. Unassuming. He didn't shift in his seat like the others. He didn't check his phone. His eyes never left Zariah from the moment she walked in. He stood, not abruptly, not with anger, just purpose. The room turned slightly toward him. The judge glanced up for the first time. So did Drennan. "Sir," the bailiff asked. The man didn't speak. He reached slowly into his coat, every officer in the room tense. But what he pulled out wasn't a weapon. It was a badge. He held it high, steady. "Agent Darius Lane, Federal Intelligence and Internal Affairs. I'm here for my daughter." A gasp rippled through the room. Judge Collier's mouth opened slightly, but nothing came out. Zariah didn't move. She didn't turn, didn't smile, just exhaled slow, deliberate, like a weight had finally acknowledged its presence. Agent Darius Lane didn't move beyond the gallery at first. He didn't raise his voice, didn't flash the badge around. He let the weight of those words, "I'm here for my daughter," hang in the air like a pressure drop before a storm. The judge finally spoke. "This is a court proceeding. Agent Lane, you can't just—" "Your Honor," Darius interrupted calmly. "I'm not here to disrupt. I'm here to clarify jurisdiction." He stepped forward. The bailiff flinched. So did Officer Brener. "Jurisdiction." The prosecutor, Heather Drennan, asked, lips curling slightly. "This is a local matter, a juvenile interference case." "No," Darius said, reaching into his inner coat pocket. "This is now a federal investigation into unlawful assault by an officer of the law on a civilian minor while in custody. And that's before we factor in obstruction, suppression of evidence, and judicial misconduct." He handed the folder to the clerk. The seal on the cover was unmistakable. Federal Oversight Committee. Marked urgent. Drennan opened her mouth, but no sound came. Judge Collier adjusted his robe nervously. I wasn't informed." "You were," Darius said flatly. "The documents were delivered to your office at 6:42 this morning. Someone in your clerical staff signed for them. I have the timestamp." From her seat, Zariah still hadn't turned to look at him. She didn't need to. The way her breath had slowed said everything. He was here, and he wasn't here to beg. Brener stood up suddenly. "She broke the law. I followed protocol." "Sit down," Darius said. His voice wasn't loud. It didn't need to be. It had the same tone Zariah used earlier. Controlled, final. The room paused. Brener didn't sit, but he stopped speaking. Darius finally turned to his daughter. For a second, just one, the mask dropped. The agent became a father. And beneath that tough exterior was something else. Fury, fear, and pride all tangled into one look. Zariah met his eye. No smile, no nod. But the connection was there, quiet. Steel strong. Judge Collier cleared his throat. "We'll need time to review these filings. This court is not accustomed to." "This court," Darius said, cutting him off, "is now under audit." The gallery stirred. Even those who came just to watch began to feel it, the shift. The moment when the script unraveled and something new took its place. Heather Drennan stood, visibly shaken but still composed. "With all due respect, Agent Lane, if there are formal charges against any party, they should be filed through proper." "They already were," Darius replied. 3 days ago, which you ignore." She blinked. And he added, "I have video." His words hit harder than a shout. Eli Randall, Zariah's lawyer, turned his head. "You do." Darius nodded once, reached into his briefcase, and handed over a drive. Body cam footage. The original, before it was scrubbed. The gallery, once drowsy and indifferent, now leaned forward. People weren't just watching a trial anymore. They were watching a reckoning. Darius turned toward the judge one last time. "I suggest you take a recess. Your Honor, before this becomes something much bigger than anyone in this room is ready for." Judge Collier hesitated, then slammed his gavel once. 15-minute recess. But everyone knew nothing would be the same when they returned. The room didn't disperse during recess. No one left to stretch their legs or check their phones. The energy had shifted, no longer a dull, passive trial, but a brewing storm. Everyone could feel under their skin. Zariah sat still. Her lip was swollen, the dried blood darkening along her jawline. Eli leaned toward her cautiously. "Zariah, that's your dad." She didn't nod. She didn't blink. "He's CIA." Her eyes stayed forward. Eli sat back like the air had just gotten colder. "Jesus," he whispered to himself. Agent Darius Lane hadn't left the courtroom. He stood near the gallery rail, arms crossed, watching the bench with quiet intensity like a predator waiting for movement. He hadn't spoken to Zariah, hadn't even approached her, and that said everything. When Judge Collier returned, his robe looked more disheveled, sweat glistened near his temple. He tapped the gavel twice. "This court is reconvened." Eli stood. "Your Honor, with new evidence provided and the presence of federal oversight, I request that the body cam footage be entered into record." Collier didn't answer right away. Heather Drennan spoke instead. "We still object." Chain of custody. "It came directly from internal federal storage," Darius said, his voice clear, cutting through her sentence like a scalpel. "Timestamped, unedited, authenticated." Heather's mouth opened, then closed. There was nothing left to argue. Collier sighed. "Let's see the footage." The clerk plugged in the drive. A hush fell over the room, like fog creeping in through the windows. The screen lit up. First, pavement. A shaky walk from Brener's chest-mounted cam. Then, an elderly black man walking slowly, confused, muttering something inaudible. Then, Brener's voice, sharp, commanding. "Move along." The man paused. "I'm just looking for my car." "Son." A beat. Then, suddenly, Brener shoved him, hard. The man staggered, his cane skidding across the sidewalk. From the side of the frame, a blur of movement. Zariah. She stepped in, not charging, not yelling, just blocking, arms out, between the officer and the old man. Her voice, he didn't do anything. "Brener, back up now." "Zariah, I'm recording this." Then, static. The video jumped. A clear, digital cut, intentional. Then silence. The clip ended. The courtroom was dead quiet. The judge cleared his throat. "There seems to be a glitch." "It's a redaction," Darius said flatly. "Intentional. The full video exists on a separate encrypted server. It was tampered with at the precinct level." Heather Drennan's face had gone pale. Eli stood again. "This proves misconduct." "No," Darius said calmly. "This proves a cover-up." Then he turned, slowly, not to Zariah, not to the judge, but to the gallery. "There's more," he said. "But what matters now is how this court chooses to respond." Eyes turned to Judge Collier, but the judge wasn't meeting anyone's gaze, because he knew the story he thought he was in had changed, and the girl they tried to silence had just become the center of something no one could control. The judge didn't say a word for a long time. His pen trembled in his hand. The gavel sat untouched. The gallery sat stiff as stone. And then Officer Brener stood again. His voice was louder this time, sharper. "That video is incomplete. It doesn't prove anything." "You're right," Agent Lane said without hesitation, "which is why I brought the complete version." He turned to the side of the courtroom and gestured. From the hallway, a second agent entered. Black suit, dark shades, carrying a secure briefcase. Brener's posture changed. Stiffen. The agent placed the case on the prosecution table and opened it slowly. Inside, a monitor, a flash drive, a folder marked confidential verified copy. This, Darius continued, was pulled directly from the precinct server before the redaction occurred. It's been matched, timestamped, and cleared for presentation. Heather Drennan didn't object. She couldn't. She simply sat there, hands folded, jaw tight, the color slowly draining from her face. The bailiff plugged in the drive. This time, the video began the same, but it didn't cut out. It showed everything. Not just the push, not just Zariah stepping in, but Brener grabbing her arm, yanking her backwards, throwing her to the ground, her phone hitting the pavement. Her voice, "You can't do this." His response, "Watch me." Then the cuffing, the boot pressing her shoulder, and worse, the part no one had seen before. Brener picking up her phone, smashing it beneath his heel. Zariah crying out, and the other officer silent, complicit looking away. The screen faded to black, but this time, the silence didn't feel helpless. It felt heavy with truth. Brenner's face turned red. That was taken out of context. The courtroom erupted, not with noise but with energy. Shifts in posture, gasps, people covering their mouths. Someone in the back whispered, "Oh my God." Judge Collier slammed his gavel once. Order. But the room had already changed. Zariah hadn't flinched. She watched it all. Arms still folded, cuffs still locked. But now, she wasn't the only one watching. A juror leaned forward. The court clerk paused mid-note. Heather Drennan stared at the screen like it had betrayed her, and Eli Randall stood taller beside her. "Your Honor," he said, his voice suddenly steadier than ever. "I move to have all charges dropped immediately, and that Officer Matthew Brener be taken into custody pending federal investigation." Collier looked to Drennan. She didn't speak. She didn't blink. Darius Lane stepped forward again, calmly. "There's a process, of course, but if you refuse to acknowledge this, Judge Collier, you're going to find your name on the next file I open." Collier's lips pressed into a line. He tapped the gavel once. "All charges against the defendant are hereby dismissed. Court is in recess until further notice." But it was too late for recess. The reckoning had already begun. No one moved right away, not even after the judge left the bench. The air in the room felt thick, like everyone had inhaled something they couldn't exhale yet. The screen was black now, but the images from the video kept replaying behind everyone's eyes. Officer Brener stood frozen, fists clenched, lips twitching with a rage he couldn't release. The uniform on his chest didn't look like armor anymore. It looked like a costume he was no longer allowed to wear. Zariah still hadn't moved. Her hands, still cuffed, rested on her lap. But something had shifted in her shoulders just slightly. The weight she'd carried alone for days wasn't hers alone anymore. Eli turned to her, kneeling. "Zariah, we're getting you out of those cuffs. Right now." He looked toward the bailiff. "She's free. Take them off." The bailiff hesitated, glancing at the prosecution table. But Heather Drennan wasn't looking at anyone. She stared down at the folder in front of her, unmoving. Her world had shrunk to the size of a courtroom bench, and the fallout she couldn't stop. Darius Lane didn't raise his voice. He simply walked toward the table. His presence was enough. The bailiff stepped forward, unlocked the cuffs, and stepped back without a word. Zariah didn't rub her wrists. She didn't sigh. She just pulled her hands into her lap like she hadn't been restrained for over 48 hours. The moment was quiet, but far from peaceful. Behind them, the second agent approached Darius. He leaned in, whispering something. Darius's face didn't change, but his nod was sharp, final. He turned toward the gallery, then back to Zara. "Come with me." She stood finally, no limpy, no flinch. She moved like she hadn't been hit, like the blood had never dried on her chin. As they walked past the defense table, Eli tried to speak. "Zariah, But she didn't stop. Not out of anger, but because there was nothing left to explain. They walked the center aisle, silent. The gallery parted like water. Some people stood, others couldn't meet her eyes. But everyone felt the shift. This wasn't the walk of a victim. It was the walk of someone who had never needed to yell to be heard. Then a voice from behind broke the quiet. It was soft, unsure. A teenage boy sitting near the back row, his eyes were wet. I saw that video before it was deleted. I thought it was fake. I'm sorry. Zarya paused. She turned her head just slightly. Her eyes met his. I know, she said. Then she kept walking. Outside the courthouse, the air felt different. Cooler. Sharper. The kind of chill that comes when a long-hidden truth finally sees sunlight. Zarya stepped through the doors with Darius beside her. No police escorted them. No news cameras shoved in their faces, not yet. But word had already spread. A crowd had started to form. Some held phones, others held silence. All of them held breath. Someone whispered, "That's her, not the girl on trial, not the troublemaker. Just her." Darius didn't speak. His hand hovered near Zarya's shoulder, protective without controlling. He looked like a father who had spent years pretending his heart didn't beat too loud and had just remembered why it did. A reporter stepped forward, holding a mic. "Zarya." She kept walking. The reporter tried again. "People want to know. Why didn't you speak up? Why stay quiet this whole time?" Zarya stopped, not because she was unsure, but because it was time. She turned, faced the mic and the dozen phones now raised. Her voice was steady, because sometimes silence is the only way to hear who's lying. The reporter's mouth parted. Stunned, she added, "I wasn't waiting to be rescued. I was watching who would try to bury the truth. That was all. No speed, no drama. Just true." And somehow, it hit harder than 1,000 headlines. Across the city, the video had already resurfaced. Darius's team had quietly released it to independent journalists, the full, uncut footage. Within minutes, it hit social platforms. Within hours, it had already been shared 1,000,000 times. Hashtags formed. Silent Shield. Justice for Zarya. Uncuffed. At schools, teachers replayed her words. Activists printed them on banners. Churches added her name to prayer lists. But most powerful of all people stopped calling her a victim. They called her a witness, not just of a crime, but of a system, one that had tried to break her in silence. And failed. Inside the courthouse, the fallout began. Officer Brener was placed on immediate unpaid leave. But whispers already said federal charges were imminent. Judge Collier locked himself in his chambers. Heather Drennan left through the back stairwell. No statement. No press. Her office voicemail already full. And the bailiff, the one who didn't move when Zarya was slapped, submitted his resignation by sundown. Back on the courthouse steps, Zarya took a deep breath. Not relief. Not pride. Something deeper. Like a storm that had passed, but left the air charged. Darius leaned in. "You ready to go home?" Zarya nodded once, but her eyes weren't looking at the street. They were watching the people still standing, still silent, and for the first time since she entered that courtroom, she smiled. Just a little, but it was enough. They didn't drive home right away. Darius took a detour. No words. Just a glance and Zarya understood. He pulled into a small, quiet lot near the riverfront. The sun had begun to set, casting long shadows across the dashboard. Zarya leaned her head against the window, watching the light bend across the water. She hadn't said anything since they left the courthouse. Neither had he. But silence had never felt more like understanding. After a few minutes, Darius finally spoke. "I almost didn't come." She didn't turn. "I thought maybe I wasn't the father you needed. Maybe I'd make it worse." Zarya's voice was soft. "You were watching. Always," he said. Another pause. She turned then, slowly. "So why now?" He looked out toward the horizon. "Because I thought you might be strong enough to do it alone. But I realized no one should have to be." That hit harder than she expected, because for the first time in days, maybe longer, she let herself feel it. The weight, the isolation, the fury she'd buried beneath silence. "I was so angry," she whispered. "I know." I wanted to scream. "I know," he repeated. "But I knew if I did, they'd say I was dangerous." His hand found hers, not forceful, just present. "And instead, you made them afraid of your calm." They sat there, Just like that, a father who had seen too much, a daughter who had endured more than most adults could bear. And between them, no need for explanation. The car remained still, but the world outside was already moving. By midnight, Zariah's image was everywhere, not as a mugshot, not as a suspect, but as a symbol. The still frame of her standing, uncuffed, face calm, in front of a courtroom built to silence her. The quote followed closely behind. Sometimes silence is the only way to hear who's lying. People printed it, tattooed it, wrote it on protest signs, on school walls, in captions across social media posts. Not because it was catchy, because it was true. A week later, a new case was dismissed after public outcry. A police chief resigned, a judge in another district quietly stepped down, and Officer Brener, charged not just for misconduct, but for destruction of evidence, perjury, and assault of a minor in custody. He never smiled for the cameras again. As for Zariah, she didn't grant interviews. She didn't sign with a publicist. She didn't run for anything. She went back to school. Same backpack, same quiet steps. But when she entered the building, teachers paused. Students moved aside not in fear, but in recognition. And one girl, sitting alone at lunch, scooted her tray to make room. Zariah sat. No words exchanged. But the silence between them, it was powerful. And somewhere in a classroom, written on a whiteboard by a teacher who believed in more than grades, to the girl who never yelled, but made the world listen. In a world where those who scream often get heard first, she didn't need to yell. She stood still, and the system unraveled in front of her. Because silence isn't weakness, it's patience, it's presence, it's power, waiting to strike where it matters most. If this story moved you even a little, don't let it fade in the scroll. Leave a comment. Share it with someone who's ever been told they were too quiet to matter. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on notifications. Because here at RonStories, we don't just tell what happened, we tell what silence remembers.